Okay, welcome to week 3 of 3D modeling class. Today we're going to be dealing with our mode of transportation, and hopefully by now you guys have taken some time, really thought about what sort of object you'd like to make. We used the term mode of transportation so that if you wanted to try and develop anything from a motorcycle to a sports car to some futuristic piece of machinery, then that would be perfectly fine. I have chosen for this video to create this kind of a Dr. Seuss lowrider moped bike. And so what I did real quick is just kind of did a sketch of what I'm thinking about. And so it may seem very strange and peculiar, and I certainly hope so because that was the intent. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through the process of getting this image into Maya so that we can use it as reference while we're working. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to do is, just like every other time, I need to create a brand new project because this is a new object that's going to have its own source images, its own everything. So I'm going to go to Project, New, and I'm going to say that it is week 3, and I'll tell it that it's going to be under 3D modeling. And I'll say that it's just going to be right up underneath here. Now, just to be absolutely sure, we're going to call it 3D underscore modeling underscore week underscore 03. Okay, so it's going to be 3D modeling week 3. I'll say use defaults and hit accept, and we can double check that it's indeed done that simply by coming over here. Oops. We'll find 3D modeling, week 3, and there it is. Okay. Now, as we go about doing all of this, the next thing we'll do, we'll just hit cancel. Now remember, my computer just has this issue with permissions just because I have higher security on it. Not to worry, everything should be fine. We'll go File, Save Scene As. Instantly we see that we're in the 3D modeling week 3 scenes file, and I'll call this week 3 mode of transportation, and I'll call this Seuss bike. Okay, now there are several different ways to get this image to exist inside of Maya. Now, the first one is obviously, if you can imagine, since we've already talked about texturing, would be to make a plane, make it the right size, open up my Hypershade, go in here, get like a surface shader, which doesn't require a lot of information. Tell it that we want to make a file, and then choose that file. Now, the first thing we need to do is make sure, absolutely sure, that my picture, this vehicle right here, I'll just say Control C, and I'll put it inside of here, Control V, and say Open. Okay, and then we can open up our Hypershade, select our plane, and then assign it. Okay, now this may be a situation for you. If you open up a picture and you get something like this, that's because the computer that you're using is trying very hard to make your scene take as little information as possible so that it works faster. Now, I trust this picture. I know that it's not that big. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the hardware texturing options, and I'm going to come down here to texture resolution. And right now it's set to default, and this is what I get if I say default. Well, if I move it up to medium, notice how the information is starting to clear up. That means that if I go to high, I'm starting to see it even clearer. And if I go to highest, it is as though it's the picture that I started with. But you may notice something. If I look at the picture here, it is quite long versus that, which is not. The reason being is because this image is on a perfect square, right? If we just look at the picture, that right there is a square. That means that I would have to stretch it out by scaling it outwards until I get what I want. Now, because this isn't being done perfectly to scale, let's say, for example, this is not a commercial for some name brand automobile or a famous motorcycle advertisement, that if I messed up the scale of it in the very beginning, it would be a very big problem for me. But here it's not, because this is my model and I can really do with it as I want. So I would simply raise it up, I would push it a little further back, and I would make sure that just by going into my attributes that the rotation was set to 90 so that it sits up straight. Okay. Then what I could do is create a new layer simply by coming over here, and you can see that because I used the one that says create a new layer and assign the selected object all in one button, it's right here, it's being used, and I'll just turn it to a reference. Now I can't accidentally select this anymore, and I can begin working. The other way to do it, however, and I'll just delete this, is to actually use, and because this is, remember, this image is a sort of a side view of my bike, is to use the side view and go to View, Camera Attribute Editor, and then we can actually affix the image to this camera simply by going into my environment and saying create an image plane. So if we create an image plane, look at what we get. Well, we see this and it says, well, what are we using? We're using an image file. What's the image file's name? We don't have one yet. So I have to click on this and simply go get the image, and there it is. Now notice that the space is exactly the way that the image was, because this image was already widescreen and my options are set to simply use this image to the resolution that it started with. All right, now I can see the fit is set to best, which means that it's simply using the image. I could force it to be something else. That's not a problem. However, we don't want that to happen. Now there's something else about this that you need to understand as well. If I open this up, you see that this is in fact sitting in space, but it's not really visible. And if I try to select it, what I'm really selecting is the camera. Okay? So if we don't want it to be visible inside of this view while we're working, we have to come up here and say it is only displayed looking through the camera that it started with. Now all of a sudden you see that it disappeared, but it's still down here. All right. Now I would say that this grid for this image is probably a little distracting, so I'm just going to simply go to Show and turn off the grid visibility. And now I have this nice little object that I can start working with. Now, if I go to Create, and let's just start with a cube, it's simple enough, right? I can make it a little bit bigger, and looking at it here, we can see that, sure enough, there it is. If I look at it in wireframe, sure enough, I can see that it goes wireframe, but the picture does not. That's very helpful in this situation, and I can even go to Shading and choose X-ray so that my object is in fact both a little bit solid and a little bit transparent, so I can see through it while I start to shape my object. Okay? Now, once I begin this, I'm just going to shrink this down so we can work within this area. It may be something that seems as though an object like this should use a NURBS object because we've been using curves to make these shapes. It's not absolutely necessary. It is entirely up to you. Remember, there is no right and wrong way at this point. It's simply a faster way, an easier way, a way that makes sense to you. And because a lot of the modeling techniques that I'm going to show you in the future have to do with box modeling, we're going to model with a box. So if I want to, I could choose Face and select this edge and simply go Extrude. And then rather than trying to drag it out with the tool, I'll simply hit the W key so that I can move it into position. And then I can even right-click on the object, grab my vertices, and start to change it, because you'll see that this area here has a little bit of a wider edge as this starts to thin out. Now, there's another way you can do it. Of course, you can sit here and say G to redo it again, W, drag over, G, W, pull it again, G, W, okay? And then you just go back after a little bit of modeling and start cleaning things up. Now notice that I'm not purposely trying to get every tiny little nuance. Well, that's because I know that when I'm done, I'll be smoothing this object in a different way. Okay, now if we look at it here, we see that sure enough it's simply an object that's moving in space and it doesn't really look very impressive. However, if I hit the 3 button, suddenly we see this object as a very smooth object, right? And if I look at it here, I can start to see that this object is in fact a nice smooth object that is starting to take those contours. So understand though that what we're looking at right now, because I'm using the 1, 2, 3 technique, this is simply a preview. Okay, this object does not really look like this just yet. All right, and what I mean by that is if I just go back into my object, I'll smooth it, and then I'll just do a test render. And what you'll see is that it is the original square object. Now we'll talk more about how to smooth these out towards the end of this video, but for now I'm just using the preview so that I can get a better quality image. Now in many cases, because we're doing something that requires this to travel along an edge, we can do another technique simply using this object that we've started with, but I'm going to create a CV curve. And I'm going to start here, and I'm going to travel along the shape of this curly Q. Okay. Now many of you might already be familiar with this. So if I go face, and I will choose that face that is in the front, and then I'll select the curve. So I'll go to my edit mesh, and I'll go to my extrude options. Now by default, the option is already set on to use the selected curve for an extrusion. You might as well keep this on because if you don't have a curve selected, you'll simply make one subdivision, which is perfectly fine. Okay, and then we'll hit extrude. Now this doesn't look very good, but that's because I have to go into its history, and there's 2 places that you can do this to. You can either go into the options here in the channel box and simply slide down until you find the divisions option, highlight it, and drag it out. And as we're increasing that number, we're increasing the curve. Okay? The other way to do it, I'll just undo, is go into my options box here, and then I can increase it simply by choosing the subdivisions option here. Now, you'll notice that inside of this option, when we look at it at the bottom, I have a taper option, and I can simply turn it higher or lower. And that definitely helps because I'm going to make a curve go very, very small towards the end. And I don't want it too small, but I'll make it, let's say, 0.1. That works for me. However, the other thing that I can do, if I go into the more advanced options, is I can create a taper curve, which means the entire thing can not only change shape here, but I can begin to create alternate highs and lows. So if I wanted some areas to bubble outward and then taper in to then bubble back out, that's how I could do it. And notice that we have a taper of 0.1 right now. This taper of 0.1 is first influencing the object, then I'm coming out with these, which means if I start to change this taper option, things are going to start becoming much, much more over obvious. Okay? Now I kind of like that because it's a little too silly, and after all, if this is kind of being the, children's Dr. Seuss kind of vehicle, that might be more what I'm looking for. Again, it's entirely up to you. So then I'll select my object. I'll go Edit, Delete History, because I no longer need this curve to tell it what to do. I want this object to simply be its own object. All right. The next thing I need to do is make a decision. Do I want to adjust this so that it is in fact 100% like the image? If you're doing something that requires you to be very meticulous, like we were saying, a name brand car, a well-known company for, motorcycles or whatever. If you're doing something that is more conceptual, something that you've kind of invented on your own, these are the sorts of things that might surprise you. Because when you get in here and you're actually starting to build it, you might turn around and say, you know what, this other way that I did something, I kind of like it better. Whereas, for example, here, I have it going very small, but I think at the very end, I'm just going to kind of bubble it out. And then we'll do this. And maybe that's going to be, oh, you know what? That kind of reminds me of making my vehicle's horn. So we'll extrude and then bring it in, extrude again, pull it in, extrude again to make it more of a tight shape. And then I'll grab, let's say, the edges around this part, double click. That way I can just move this up and out of the way, double click there, tug it up and out of the way, and then I'll grab this so that I can scale just a little bit and then rotate. Rotate it there and rotate it there. By the way, I'm double clicking, and when you're working with quads, that means that there's an even number, 4-sided polygons. When we double click, it instantly recognizes that it goes all the way around. Okay, so while you're working, that becomes very helpful. All right, now I've made some decent progress, so I'm going to hit Control S so that now I have it saved and I can continue working. Now, we have this area here where it just kind of dips in, and it looks as though a whole new curved piece starts. Now you have two options here. You can either begin making your object separate, or you can simply continue using the object that you've already started making. Because we're doing polygons, polygons offer us a much greater freedom while we're modeling. Because as I start to make extruded edges, I'm also making extruded edges towards the bottom. So if I grab that extruded edge and I extrude it, I can begin to pull it down. And then it's just a matter of realigning to set things where I want them. Okay. So I'll hit extrude again, drag it up, and I'll just drag all the way up so that I can show you another tool. And if we go turn off X-rays, you can see it a little better. Okay. Now, if I use my Poly Cut Faces tool, I can start creating laser slices through here, and then take those laser slices, bits at a time, and create my arc. Right? Fairly simple. Okay. Now, it's entirely up to you if you wanted to create your object with a few or a lot of curves. Certain objects you might look at and instantly say, oh, I know I can do that with a curve. For example, this one is this area right here. If I simply do that, grab hold of my face, grab hold of the curve, select the curve. What's going on? Let me undo. Select and select. Okay, so face, and then shift select. Oh, now it's working. So we'll extrude. And again, it was only a single division, so we'll increase that. And now we'll have, I think that's a little too much. I think I'm going to drag that back down just a bit. There's no reason to go that much detail in that tiny little space. So drag this over, drag this over, drag that there. Now you'll notice that a lot of this, while we're working, it's just about pushing and pulling points until you get what you want. And so whenever somebody says, what's the secret of modeling, you know, how do you make your models look so good? I just say I push and I pull until it looks right. You know, this can sometimes take days. It can sometimes take a week. It can sometimes take, you know, however long you have to actually create your object, create your project. Now remember, when we look at our inputs and we see this long list like this is all of that history. Okay, the very top one is the last thing that you told it to do. So here's my divisions, here's my taper, and I'll just bring that in just a bit. Okay. Then I'm going to select my object, and I'm going to delete my history, and now all of a sudden all of that information is gone. Go back to 1 so that I can see how my object is really looking. Just pull that in a little bit, go back to 3. Okay. So again, remember, this is not really what the object looks like. This is what the object really looks like. For now. That doesn't mean that it won't look better later. Okay. Now, intersecting. This is the sort of thing that will take place later on when we start to clean up our model. However, I'll say this right now. Because there's such a drastic curve, if I was planning to rig this, and we're not getting into rigging in this class, this is just 3D modeling, I would have to be very, very cautious about where my vertices are intersecting, just because it would give me problems later. However, for this case, we're not going to worry about that right now. Okay. All right. So I'll hit Control S, save that. Now that I'm happy with that piece, I'm going to begin on another piece. Okay. So the next thing that I'd like to do is let's just finish off the front end. Okay. And this is, again, something that looks very, very detailed, something that may take me quite a while to create. But it all depends on how I choose to make it. Okay. So if I were to create, again, a polygon cube, and I'll just bring it over. And by the way, if you create something and you know that you're already in your move tool and you don't actually see it, use the middle mouse button and simply drag it over, because even if I'm not actually on it, if I use my middle mouse button, I can still move it around. Okay? So I'll simply put it into position, scale it fairly appropriately, create my curve, and just draw out my curve. Hit enter. Grab my face, shift, select my curve, and extrude. Increase the divisions, and decrease the taper, and I think I'll choose 0.05 for the very end of that. Alright, this is a good example of needing this taper curve, because if I bring it in, I can really control how big the end point is and still keep the outside middle better. And by the way, all I have to do is click inside of this area and I've created a new one. Okay? And if I don't want it, if I accidentally make too many, it's just Xing out the one on the bottom. Alright. So let's see, if we reduce the number of little subdivisions here and hit 3, oh, I think that actually looks okay. I think we're doing just fine. Okay, so again, I like what I have so far, so hit save. And let's just work on this bell. Now, there's many, many ways that you can make a bell, right? You can start out with a polygon if you wanted to. You could start out with a cylinder, or you could start out with a cube, right? You could just have a cube, cut it the different faces, or extrude where you wanted the bell to come out of. Hit 3, and it's already starting to look like a bell, right? Oh, what did I do? Oh, I angled it. Sorry about that. So we'll pull it down, we'll extrude it out, hit extrude again, pull it in, extrude again, pull it up. Okay, so there's a fairly decent bell. And if I wanted to, I could, of course, adjust the edges. Double click, scale that outward, double click here, scale that inward. Okay, and then double click here, oops, double click here, scale it in, and there we go. So it would look like this until we smoothed it out, and it would end up looking like that. The other way to do it is, of course, we could use a curve. We could jump into our front or our side view, and let's just use our side view real quick, and draw out the actual shape of my bell, hit enter. But then, of course, we would have to see what our grid looks like so that we knew that it would have to be over here. So we select the edge, hold down X so we can snap to the grid. And then we'd have to hold down D and then X at the same time so that we could snap to grid so that our center point is along that 0 line. Go into our surfaces, revolve, and now we have a NURBS bell. Now, is one better than the other? No. Did one take longer than the other? No. Modify, center pivot. There's my control handle. Drag it over. Now it is nearly identical to the size that I wanted. Either way worked just fine, right? So hit save again. Now if I go create polygon, I can say I would like to create, well, let's start with, well, we're going to make this wheel. So why don't we first start with the torus, because the torus is essentially our donut shape. And I'll drag this over, and I'll rotate this down so you can see it. So I'll say 90 degrees. We'll reduce the number of subdivisions here, because when I hit 3, we'll see that it's still smooth at 10 by 10. And if I decrease the number there, we're still looking fine. Now, if we open up this, we can say we want to reduce the radius. Let's make that 0.2. That makes it look like a nice little tire shape. And then we'll keep it about that size. Now, I'm not going to... Sorry, I accidentally hit the S button. That's why all these changed color. We're not keyframing anything. I don't want to turn this into an oval yet, okay? Because we're going to be building the center, and we don't want to mess up the relationship between the center and the shape yet, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab hold of these faces, because we're going to be making this. We're going to be making this, this, and this. So I want this one, this one, this one, and this one. And it's a little off-centered, but remember, anything off-centered, not perfect, is perfectly Seussian. And I will go back to my polygons, and I will extrude. And then from my extrusion, I will pull straight out to get that. Okay, then I'm going to grab hold of these two, grab hold of these two, grab hold of these two, grab hold of these two. I'm just holding down Shift to do that, and extruding. And again, I'll extrude straight. Okay, now this might start looking kind of weird, but that's okay. I just have to make some adjustments as I go along. And remember, since this is very Seuss-like, weird is a good thing. Okay, now in order to round this out, chances are the best thing to do would be to grab the edges here, pull them outward. But if that's not working, it's because there's nothing here. So why don't we use the insert edge loop, create a line there, create a line there, create a line there, one there, one there, and one there. So now we have more elements to choose from, so we can start controlling it a little easier. And we'll start rounding this out again. Now notice that I can grab hold of by double clicking, and then I don't even actually have to be on that arrow. I can use the middle mouse button like we were talking about before, simply to drag outward. Okay. So that'll be a good start. That looks kind of fun. And if I wanted to, I could always increase or decrease. You know, it's kind of a free modeling thought process at this point for me. But if I wanted to, I could make it look more interesting, less interesting, you know, whatever. So push inward. Push outward. You know, it's however you want the object to look. Now, there's just a couple of simple things that I'd like to talk about while we're doing this. Some of you may have noticed that if we have more than one object selected, and one of them is not facing the same way, if you tried to move your objects back and forth, they may not be working like this. Okay? If that's not happening, you have to double-click on your tools. Now, depending on the version of Maya you're using, this may have popped up on the other side, but that's no big deal. If your move axis is set to object, as I start to drag them, it might start doing this. Okay? The reason that that's happening, I'll go all the way back to the beginning, is because of this. When we make an object, this object knows which way is up, right? It knows that Y is Y, and that this face was built facing Y. If I rotate it this way, as far as this object is concerned, this is still its version of up, which is why when we come back to move our object, this green arrow is here, whereas this green arrow is here. So if I select both of these objects and I tell both of the objects, move along your y-axis, they both say, okay, I'll move along my y-axis. Okay? Now, if we double-click and say, no, use the world as your version of y, it says, oh, okay, I'll go y based on the world. Okay? So when we're moving objects around, if you grabbed a bunch of things and you started doing this, you might notice that things just kind of come and go as they please sometimes, and that's what's happening. And I'll go ahead and delete history because I noticed that I never did when I had that curve. We don't need that curve right now anymore. So I'll hit save. And notice that these objects are not combined. Each one of these different pieces will be able to be a different piece. All we're going to do is simply make them look like they're connected. And as long as they look like they're connected, no one will know the difference. Okay? Just to let you know, this was one way of doing it. I can delete it, and I can start doing something completely different. We could use NURBS objects. We could start with a cylinder. Let's open up a cylinder and say there's no cap divisions. Hit create, drag it over, run it over to the side. Go negative 90 degrees. That should be nothing. That should be nothing. Now it's perfectly straight again. And I could put this, bring it in some. Let's reduce the number of divisions. And I'll say we only want 8. 8 should be good. And I'll make it small so that it will become the center only. And then we'll extrude certain faces, but not all of them. We want this one, this one, this one, and this one. So if I look at it, it's every other one. And then I'll go extrude, pull it outward. Okay. And then I'll rotate with all of them selected, and I'll just do this. And now they've already begun spinning around for me. See that? So we rotate so that they're spinning. Now what I'm going to do is I'll spin it just a little bit further than I think I might need. Use my split polygon tool. Oops, excuse me, not my split polygon tool. Undo that. Sorry about that. My computer was wondering what happened to my USB drive. Okay, so we'll go to the Insert Edge Loop tool. That's what I was expecting to do. Split each one of them. And then we'll grab the vertices or the edges, really doesn't matter. Okay, so select these. Select the rest of them. and we'll rotate those just a bit, just to kind of give kind of like a fun swirl. Okay. So then I can rotate the center, kind of smooth it out, or make it more drastic. It's entirely up to me. You know, we're looking at it based on what we want to create. So then I'll delete history. And then we'll go ahead and create another one of those torus objects. There's my donut. Rotate it -90. Reduce the number on both sides. Hit 3 so we can see whether it's good and smooth or not. We'll just make that subdivision of 8, subdivision of 10.2. Increase the radius a little. I'll put that here. And then what we'll do is we will grab the edges, the faces, going around each side, but not the edge itself, not the very tip of that. And we can extrude. Now let's just see what that gives us. See, so you can see that's actually a very similar shape to what I was doing before. However, because it's now 2 objects, I have more control over it, right? Because I can increase this just until that disappears, or I can bring those back in, increase this ever so slightly. Let's just keep it like that for now. All right. Now when we look at the side of motorcycle or bike tires, if we want to make it feel like this object has some weight on it, the easiest way to do that is to simply go into the object, go to the edge, double click here, and we'll just scale in. So that'll start flattening out my tire a little bit. Just enough, not too much. There we go. Okay. And so then the next thing that I could do, we'll grab another, let's say another cylinder. And this time I'm going to use my snap by holding down V and using my middle mouse key. I can make it snap no matter where it was. It's going to be over here now. So I'll go -90, scale that in. And now we can really start doing some details to this object. So we'll move it over, put that there. Let's see what that looks like. Scale that a little bit, pull it out some so that it sticks through. Duplicate it, move it over here. And let's turn on shading, duplicate it, move it over here. Duplicate it, moving over here. So now we have this little guy going on. So we'll duplicate that, bring it to the center. Now I'm just eyeballing the center. We don't have to worry about whether or not it's perfectly centered, but we are trying to make it look interesting at least. So we can extrude both out at the same time. Extrude outward like that. And then we'll extrude up and out. And then with both of those faces still selected, I'll go ahead and bevel so that I can create a nice rounded end cap, just like that. See? So then we can increase until it's good and smooth. All right. Now with all of these objects, I'm going to go ahead and select all of them, hit Control G, modify center pivot, or you can always come back over to the options and say group, go to your group options and say the group pivot can be the center of your group rather than the origin of the world. You could just say that and hit group. That's entirely up to you. And then we'll just bring this over. And I'm going to shift it over to one side so that these two can kind of hook in on each other. Just like that. Now it doesn't really matter whether or not it's exactly touching. It just has to look as though it belongs there, right? So I'll grab all of these objects and slide it maybe over just slightly in the opposite direction. Yeah, that would work. And then I can drag this piece. If I wanted this to be more centered, all I would have to do is go to my animation settings, create a lattice, and then just drag the points from the lattice over some. And that's going to help me to distort this object evenly using that lattice to control it. Then once I'm happy with it, we delete history, and there we go. All right. So you can see it's all starting to come together little by little, and it's just a matter of adding new bits and pieces to it. And then of course we need to organize, so we'll go to my hypergraph hierarchy, which is currently a little out of organization. But notice that I started making groups out of the important parts, and let's start naming things as well. So this will be front tire group, and this will be the bell. This will be the main body. This curve doesn't belong anywhere anymore, so let's just delete that. This will be the front wheel arm. And these two objects are just random blocks right now, but I could certainly use them, but I won't for now. Okay. So looking at what we've got so far, you can see that I've made quite a bit of progress in a short amount of time. Now the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create a NURBS plane, just a regular NURBS plane, and currently it has patches of 1 to 1, which we'll adjust in a minute. But we're going to scale this out, and I'm going to make the canopy. And this is another really useful thing. The fact that we have this image means that I don't have to try to build each piece connected to each other all at the same time, because as I'm building these little arms up here, as I'm making new improvements to it, all of these things are going to come in time. Okay. Zoom out a little bit. And we'll start dragging these bits and pieces. Now I can't really see the object because we're dead straight on it, but I can follow that curve to know whether or not I'm making my curve properly. Okay, so there we go. Now let's say, for example, we wanted this front end to go less, right? Well, truthfully, I could simply grab all of these and start scaling them in. It's easy enough to do. Or I could always use my lattice tool. So we're still in animation options. I'll go create deformer, make a lattice, grab hold of my front lattice points, simply drag them in, grab hold of my object, delete history, and there we go. Now, go there. So looking at my picture, I have my endpoints kind of higher, sort of so that the center looks like it's kind of slumping. So I'll go right click and go into my hull, go into my wireframe, hit 1 so I can see things clearer, grab hold of my two centers and just bring them down a little bit so that it starts to sag. Do the same thing with my two outer edges, and if I wanted to I could drift it just even further, just for more of a whimsical kind of look to it. Okay, and there's my overhang for my chair. Now it's obvious that this is kind of a low rider. That we have the oversized wheel, which by the way looks a lot like this one. So we have the option of simply grabbing this entire group. And remember, if you wanted to grab a group, you just select one of the objects and hit up. So we have the entire group now. I'll duplicate it, shift it over, and I can enlarge it. And rather than just having 2 wheels, you might want to have a 3-wheeled bike. Duplicate it, shift it over. So if I move up, it can tell me how far into the translate X I am. I'm at 3.2. Let's just change that to 3.2. So I can select this and say, no, be negative 3.2. Oh, it's not going to work for me. Okay. So, oh, that's right, because we started shifting things around. So let's hold down the X button. Let's first go modify freeze transformations, center pivot so that it's in the center. Do the same thing to this one, freeze transformations, center pivot. Hold down X to drag it, and now freeze transformations so that 0 really is 0. Move it over. Hold down X to snap to the grid. Freeze transformations. This one is at 4.07. Let's just do 4.0. There we go. So if we wanted to, now that we are starting to see the object in 3D, these wheels may not seem big enough to me now. I'm really starting to think that they could be even sillier if they were bigger. So I'll just grab both of them and scale them larger, and then pull them further out. Yeah, that's starting to look a little better. I kind of like that shape more now. But now I have to bring them higher because they don't line up with the ground plane. So we'll do this. Line them up with my ground. Yeah, that looks more fun. I like that much better. Okay, so I'll hit save because I'm happy with my work so far. Go create polygon cube. I'm going to bring this down here. So this will represent the chair, and in this case the chair is sort of a ridiculous shaped creation. Polygon, extrude, go all the way up, shrink it down, hit 3 so you can see, extrude outward. Now what I want for this, and by the way, since okay, so now that we've gone through, we've started to build the outline of it, just wanted to go over a couple of really quick things that you may have noticed if you're going through some of the book exercises. When we duplicate an object and we want it to be exactly where the other side is, there are a couple of different ways to do it, and it really all depends on what you're planning to use it for. So let's say, for example, if we were going to create a polygon cube, and the length of this object was going to be on one side, let's say that this is sort of the armrest or the handrail, something like that. All right, and you wanted it not only to be in the right position, but you also wanted to freeze transformations and everything else. So we go modify freeze transformations. So we look at it here, and it's still center pivoted. That means if I duplicate it, I could, of course, just force it to move over and hope for the best. But there's also another way to do it. Now, earlier I showed you by just real quick templating these wheels, I could duplicate them and slide them over. But now that we have this other extra piece that I will turn into where the wheel connects, so let's just real quick do that. And you'll also notice that as time goes by, if it's something that I've done many times in the past for these videos, I'm really not going to point them out quite as much as I was in the beginning, and that just means that while you're watching, if I do anything that's confusing or something that you're not quite catching, oftentimes it's just a matter of watching and seeing what it was I did and just say, oh yeah, that's right, I've seen him do that before, sort of thing. Okay. Okay, so I'll scale this down and push it over so that it works like that. Okay, so if I hit 3, that's what I've got so far. Okay. Now, when we're doing something that we know we're planning on smoothing, let's see, use my insert loop. You'll see that if I hit the 2 button, I get to see both the smooth preview and the original. Well, watch what happens when I increase this line right here. Notice how it really starts to even out, and that's because it has enough information to make a smoother transition. So that means that the further you have between your pieces, the more distorted your polygons can become, but that's going to come a little bit later. Okay. So what I'm doing right now is I'm just kind of eyeballing a new design that I wasn't planning on earlier. Now that I'm seeing this world object inside of 3D, I'm just coming up with new ideas to kind of make this maybe a little bit more fun or whimsical, interesting, that kind of thing. Okay, so that's good. Now I'll go back to 1 so we can see what we're doing. And now we know that if we select, go back to object mode. If we select this one object and we hit the up button, here is our front tire group. Okay. Now there's something about this tire that's a little bit different than a perfect tire, and that was because when I built this, I wasn't really worried about whether or not it was dead center from the wheel. Okay. So you can see if I look at it here, the center pivot is slightly off to the side. It's not dead center. But that's okay, there's nothing wrong with that, and in fact it might make for a better design, especially if I wanted to, say, take this, and remember we're going for whimsical and silly, so if we had something that was a little off, this, when it would spin, would start to spin a little wobbly, and that would probably add a little bit of character to it. Okay? But if we want to be able to take this entire thing, and I'll just hit up to go into that top group, and we'll open up our hypergraph. And here's that top group. Okay. Now, if we look at the other one, what am I looking at here? I don't think that exists. Oh, that's the front tire. That's right. Okay. So here's the tire, and this is going to be my little chassis, right? This is the body of the bike. So let's just call this chassis, and we'll call this left because it's the left side. Well, I'm going to take this tire group and the chassis, and I'll group that. So now we have a group which holds the tire group and holds the chassis. Okay, that means that when I create this object, and remember when we grouped, I told you that the options inside of here were to parent it and put it down to the center pivot or to the origin. Well, I keep it to the origin because when I want to duplicate things, it's much easier to be able to duplicate it from here. Okay, so I'm just going to show you something really quick. Here's the, remember, RGB is X, Y, Z. So if I look at a red square, before I select it, notice that as soon as I select it, it turns yellow. But before I select it, if it's red, I know that we're talking about the X-axis going across in this direction. So if I start scaling in this direction, okay, we look up here, and sure enough, we see that it's scaling less and less. But as I cross over that 0 line and I continue forward, I'm now getting a negative number. So that means that if I just undo real quick, if I duplicate my object, okay, and now we have 2 sitting on top of each other, and I simply say make it a -1, we now have that bike, wheel, and chassis dead center, exactly where it needs to be on the opposite side, exactly even with the other. Okay, so as we begin modeling, this is going to be a very big help. Now there's something else that you can do depending on how you want to build your bike, and I'm just going to hit save for now. And what you do is you can actually simply build half the object. So I'll just slide this up real quick, and let's say for example that you're going to build a car. Well, if I scaled outward and then scaled over and then increased the subdivisions, okay, I could begin to build out my car using both sides, selecting both sides and then changing the shape of them. Okay? However, another way to do it is to simply do this, and we're going to start seeing this more and more, especially when we start modeling characters. Notice that I put a center line dead through the middle, and I did that simply by creating a subdivision. All right. Now you can do it this way, or you can go back to its original square. Okay, and I'm going to look at it from the front view. So I'll just come down to the front view, hit F to focus on my square, pull back a little bit so we can see it, and I'll scale this up just a bit so you can see what's going on. Now, I right-click on it and choose Faces. All right, so if I go into Wireframe, here's that one face on the side, and this is the one I'm going to choose. Now, I'm going to choose this one because it is not only on the X, but it is on the -X. If I hold down the X button, notice how the center is changing. Just like how we did vertice snap or edge snap or anything like that, X is going to snap along the grid. So that means when I drag this over, it snaps, and it ends dead center down the 0 line. So that means that with that there, I can simply hit delete, and now I have a cube. Go back into object mode, which no matter how hard I try, as long as I don't accidentally move it around, will always scale and shrink from that center line. Okay? That means that while I begin working, I can just concentrate on this side of the car. Okay? Now it may not make sense right now because how on earth am I supposed to see what the other side looks like? Well, the reason that I hadn't shown you this yet is because it requires a few more buttons. Okay? So if I just go into object mode again, I'm going to select my object. Now you saw down here that if I hit duplicate, Control D, and hit minus for the negative number, it pops over there. Well, that's great, but the problem is I'm not done modeling it yet, and so as soon as I start changing it, I'm going to have to get rid of this and do it again. Okay, so I'll delete that. And this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up to Edit, Duplicate Special. I'm going to open up my option box, and I'm going to choose not to duplicate. Let's just turn everything back to reset the settings so that it looks like what you would see. My geometry type currently is set to copy. That means that whenever I duplicate something, it just becomes another one. The other option that I have here is instance. Instance is going to allow me to basically make a copy that still follows its original. Okay, so what that means is that when I hit this and I hit duplicate special, now the problem is you can't see it, so I'm just going to pull it up so you can see that when I choose my vertice and I start moving it around, the other one does the same thing. Okay, now let's put both of those situations together. I'm just undoing until it goes back to the one cube. So I'm going to go back to these options, go to duplicate special, open it back up, and remember now it says, okay, I remember you wanted instance last time. What we're going to do is we're going to simply go to scale, and remember when you see bars like this row, this first row, second row, third row, this is always X, Y, Z. So this is scale X, scale Y, scale Z. So if we know that we want to scale by -1 and make it an instance, when I hit duplicate special, this is what I get. So that now when I start to work on my object, the other side follows along. Now, I have to warn you because if you begin to extrude your faces and you pull them out, it may or may not do this to you, okay? Based on, okay, do you notice this? It's crossing over here. Let me just shrink this down real quick. Based on the angle of this face, okay, if I select it and because I had already shifted it over a little bit, and I'll make it much more obvious, I'll just angle it like this. Because this angle is moving at such a drastic angle in this direction, this catty corner, when I hit extrude, my initial option is to simply extrude straight out. And that means that every time I try to do it, it's going to cross over. The solution to this is very simple. As soon as I hit extrude, rather than using the default widget that they give you, I'm simply going to hit W. Notice that now we're looking at a straight line regardless of the angle of this object, so that when I pull, it pulls straight. Okay, so I can hit G and then W and drag it out. Hit G, then W, then drag it out. Okay, now from here I can change these points, and every time I do, it's going to adjust the opposite side. So it's going to give me a perfect version of my object as I'm building it, just like that. However, we can't really see this right now because it's happening inside. But remember, when we do an extrude, okay, and I'll just show you here, and I hit extrude, when I pull this out, it's going all the way around, right? Because it took a single face, and it took its 4 sides, and it extruded outward. Well, what's happening inside of this if we pull inward? Remember, the very first thing that we did to that box was to delete that one side. But look at what we have all the way down. That's because as I've extruded, each one of those extrusions, I'll hit 4, has become a wall in between. Now that may not seem like such a bad thing until you do this. Let's say, for example, I wanted my object to be smooth. See what's happening? Because of that piece, that polygon that's in between, my object thinks that it's supposed to be 2 separate pieces. Now, the solution is very simple. I've already selected my objects. Go back to 1. See, I've already selected the faces. Now it's just a matter of deleting them. I hit delete, and it goes right back to the way I was expecting. Okay? And now it's giving me the real version of my object, as if it was smoothed. Okay? Now, for certain things, as you start to build things, let's say, for example, you were making this into a spaceship. Why not? It already starts looking like a spaceship. Well, it might be enough to simply extrude from here and then pull backwards to make that cabin. However, it's probably going to give you issues, right? Sometimes it's a better idea to first increase the topology, or in other words, increase the number of polygons you're dealing with before you begin trying to make windows and hatchways and things like that. So just start getting a feel for where you want that to be. And this way, if I double click on this edge, I can expand upward a little bit. Pull this up. There we go. And now with this, it's going to look like a much better version of what I'm looking for. So I'll pull that back. And again, the same thing is happening. So if I go back to 1, we see that the reason that it's happening is because of this. So I'll simply select that face and delete it. And notice that every time I select the face on one side and delete it, that this instance, this copy, this I'm following you, is doing the same thing. Okay? So that means that when we go back to 3, now I'm starting to get what I'm expecting. Okay? So I'll just grab these points here. Also notice that because we're using the smooth preview, when I select that vertice, the point is much different. That's because when we look at it in its original pose, that's where that point is. Okay? But don't worry about that. That'll come in time. Okay.
Now, as we begin getting into more sophisticated modeling, you're going to want to, and remember, just like how we were doing the other file where we were increasing and decreasing the detail, this is a perfect example of increasing detail around this edge so that it doesn't look quite so sharp and clunky. So if I click on this, it's going to give me a ring all the way around. And notice I can work on either side. I can work on the instance version or the other version, doesn't really matter, because Maya knows that the two of these are kind of locked together. But notice what happens. If I start to scale as if I would always do, it's starting to break open. That's because I'm scaling from here away from the center. We definitely don't want that to happen. So you have to be very diligent to scale upwards. That's no problem. But when it comes time to scale over, just grab the edge that you want and pull it over. All right? Then it'll be much easier and you can create those bevels that you're looking for. Another thing is, of course, to select these points. And there we go. So now when we look at it, now it's got a little better, a little bit more information that Maya can deal with. Now, if I'm still not happy with it, I can simply increase it again, and we'll pull that outward. There we go. And see, as we increase the detail here, we're increasing the quality all the way around. So if I, yeah, that looks fine. And so if I wanted, bring that piece inward a little bit. It's starting to look like a sea cow, a manatee. It's kind of weird, but I like it. All right. Let's say, for example, we're all finished. We're happy with the way our object came out. And by the way, I don't want your mode of transportation to look this simple. The next step, I'm going to first delete history on all of it because we don't need any of that construction history. I'll select one side and simply delete it. Now that we have our final version, or half of our final version, the next and final step is to simply do this. We go to Mesh, Mirror, Geometry, go into our options, and this is simply to make sure that we know which side we're mirroring on, and it's -x. Our option is to merge with the original by merging vertices, and that's what we want. So if we merge vertices, then remember, it's just like when we choose a vertice set and hit merge. So the option is going to be there. I'll show you in a minute. And we hit mirror. Now when I select my object, it is officially all one piece. However, something happened, and I'm glad that this happened because I wanted to show you this. Notice that if we look at it at 1, we have all these different edges just like we made, but suddenly they get here and it goes into a single point. Well, remember back up here when we choose two vertices and simply say merge, we have this threshold. This threshold basically says if two vertices are this close to each other, meaning 0.01 inches, millimeters, units of measurement away from each other, I'm going to merge them. That's what happened here. Now I don't have to undo anything. I simply have to come over to my mirror options in the history, and down here the merge threshold by default is set to 0.01. Now remember, we were dealing over here with 0.01, 0.01. This is 0.1, so this is 10 times closer, and that's why it's giving us that problem. So if I change it to, let's say, half that, 0.5, and hit enter, suddenly we see that the ones that were close to each other are far away. They've gone back to where they belong. And if I select one point, not dragging across, but simply select one point and drag it away, if the two sides come together, that means that it's working. You can also simply see it by hitting the 3 button, because if these weren't connected, there would be that space, that gap. It would be very obvious. Okay? So these two techniques, building bits and pieces, duplicating them, moving them over, or building half of your object and duplicating it over, Either will work, and in fact, both will work. It all depends on your design. For something that needed to be exactly the same and very smooth, and this is sort of organic, this shape this is, that works perfectly. If you're doing something that's much more blocky, remember, sharp edges means bad people. So maybe you're doing something that has, a lot of jagged, sharp points. But notice, I can't change both sides again. So if you ever want to change something, you'll have to do this. Go into your faces, look at it from the front, select all but the half of it, see, and delete it. So now that we have that perfect half of an object again, it would be a matter of going back to Duplicate Special. Now my settings are exactly the way they were before, but just double check. Just make sure that they're going -1 on an instance, hit duplicate, and sure enough, there it is. So now, if I wanted to continue modeling, I would be able to, just like that. Okay, so I'll go back into object mode, delete those, and I'll save for good measure. Now, I know that this is primarily we're talking here, excuse me, let me adjust my microphone. I know that we're primarily talking modeling in this class, and that's perfectly fine. And I know that many of you are really excited about building and texturing and all that. We aren't going to be getting into drastic amounts of texturing simply because we have the luxury of taking our time. That means that when it does come time to be in a texturing class, hang on to these models, because they might be the very first thing you get to texturize for real. Okay, but we will go through just a little bit of some of the basic things that you might find. For example, when I extrude or bevel, sometimes I'll get something that looks like this. Okay, the reason that this is happening is simply because it's made up of a few edges, and each edge is a sharp edge against each other. Now, we've talked about this in class, but we'll go ahead and talk about this right now. If I right-click and choose Edges, and let's say that I'll just choose these here, just by marqueing over them. If I go to Normals, Soften Edge, it's hard to see if anything happens, so I have to go back into object mode. But look what happened here. Suddenly, these faces don't have those hard edges anymore, but the ones that I didn't select, they do. What this is happening, what a normal actually is, I'll explain this way. If we create a polygon, not a cylinder, a polygon cube, and I'll hit F to get to it, and let's just pull this upward so you can see what's going on. Each one of these faces has a piece of information that says how it relates to the faces around it. Now, right now, if we look at it in object mode, because this is a box, it has very sharp edges because the angle is 90 degrees, right? We have up and we have over, and each side is 90 degrees. But if I select this object and I choose these three edges, and I go to Normal, Soften Edge, if I go back into object mode, notice that we're not getting the same hard surface like we do here. We're getting something that's trying very, very hard to smooth out, to make it look like there's more here. So if I select it, we see sure enough that that's there. Now, this is a strange example because it's so dramatic. We know that there's no way that a cube could be this smooth. Okay, it would be as though these edges were actually rounded off. But I'm doing that to show you, and I'll hit delete, what happens when we have something that's a little less extreme. So I'll hit cylinder and I'll drag it up so that we can look at it. And I'll choose, let's say, we'll look at something that has 8 or 10 sides. That way we can definitely see that sure enough they have sharp edges, right? We see each edge and we see the light as it kind of glistens or cascades off, right? Well, if I select just this edge and I choose that same option, that soften, when I go back into object mode, notice that we don't have that hard edge again. It's sort of like an artificial smoothing. Okay, we're not changing the number of polygons. We're not changing any of that. All we're changing is how light will cascade across the object. So if you have things like very small bits and pieces, and you want them to seem as though they are a lot more detailed than they really are, but you just don't want the added polygons, if you soften edges, then you'll get something that starts to look like it's much smoother than it really is, and yet it still only has those few sides. Okay? Now, in some cases, you want them to be hard-edged, because maybe you're looking for something, and if we select all of these, for example, and I say normals soften, and we'll go to object mode again, we'll notice now we don't even have any location of where the bolt starts and stops. That's wrong. Same thing goes with this one edge here. We want those things to be there. So I'm going to hit undo. And this time, I'll just choose the ones that I really do want to be soft. And then I'll go into my side view, hit F so that it jumps to that, and I'll select all of them except for that hard edge that I still want. And I'll go normals, soften. Now this is the sort of thing that I'm talking about when I say towards the end you might want to start cleaning up your model. These are the sorts of options that, and you can see this is the original way it looked, and this is how it looks now. You may want to take some time and go through your model just to kind of tweak it, clean it up, make it look as good as you possibly can. Because remember, we want to look like $1,000,000 when we're showing people our work. Because then hopefully they'll actually offer us $1,000,000. Okay. So save that. Okay, the last thing that we're going to talk about, I know that I've been saving this towards the end because I wanted you to really focus on the art of modeling. If I hit the number 1 button again, we go back to what all of this stuff really looked like. Okay, now it looks kind of silly, and that's what it's going to look like when it renders, right? It looks like a bunch of boxes. However, there are several different ways that we can smooth our objects, and the reason that I haven't gotten to that point yet is because sometimes the easiest way is simply the easiest way until you need to do things with it, then it becomes the hard way. Okay? Now, the first way to do it is to simply select the object that you want to smooth. You go to Mesh and choose Smooth. And then inside of the history, you simply say, how many divisions do you want? So as I increase divisions, it becomes much, 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 much more dense. We definitely don't ever want an object to look like this, just letting you know. So I'll just go back to 2 because that is an enormous amount of polygons right there, right? And in fact, I might even have to go to 3 just to make sure that it's super, super smooth. Okay, but look what happened. As we smoothed it, this stuff started to mess up. But if I hit 3, that's going to be smoothed too. All right, now, inside of this, my history is still there. So if I go back to 1, we see what it looks like. If I go back to 0, we see what it originally looked like. Now, as I increase this number, it becomes smooth. If I delete the history on it, I no longer have that option. Okay? That means that this is the object, this is how it is, this is how it will always be. So I'm going to undo that, and even go undo until all of that option is just completely gone. Now, keep going. There we go. So now I'm back to the original one. Another way to do it is if we choose proxy, okay, this is something we've never done before, we can hit subdiv proxy. Okay. Now, subdiv simply means it is a subdivided surface. Okay. Just like how we had that option of subdivisions to make it smoother and smoother, what this is saying is, sure, make a smooth object, but make it a proxy object. So if we create a proxy, what you'll see is we will make not one, but two distinct separate objects. This one is still the original object that we had from before, but if we hit number 4, we see that there is a pink object inside. Now remember, whenever there's a pink object, what we see is what we're looking at is a object that is being controlled by the thing you have selected. Okay? Now, this is unlike what we've been doing, where we just hit 1, 2, and 3 in order to try to smooth out that object. And what I mean by that is if I select this and I open up my hypergraph, what you'll see is that the torus has become two toruses. We have the original, the outside object, and we have the inside object. Now, this is what's called high polygon and low polygon modeling. All right? That means that what we get to do is we get to model something fairly simple and then simply ask the computer to make it more complicated, to increase the topology, or the number of polygons, on each object. So if we have this object here, and I were to choose vertices, as I select the low poly vertices, the high polygon object follows along, and you can see that it follows just the way you would expect as if we were using just that standard hit the number 3 button for a smooth preview. Okay? Now, the difference, of course, is that we have two objects to deal with now. We also have, by default, we've created, or not necessarily by default, you may have to change these settings, and we'll get into the settings in just a minute. But we have two objects that we have to keep track of. We have a low polygon object, and if we look at it in the hypergraph, we see that the low polygon object has actually had this default Lambert put on it, but it's Lambert number 2, and Maya has instantly created it slightly transparent, which means that if I change the transparency, look at what happens to my object. Okay, so it's transparent so we can see through it and look at the high polygon object. Now, notice that I can't accidentally select the high polygon object. That's because what Maya also did for me, because I asked it to, is it put it inside of its own layer and turned it into a reference layer. The point is, when you're doing modeling like this, and remember, this starts to get a little bit, technical and more confusing. So it's going to take a little while for you to get the hang of it. But what we're really trying to do is we're trying to make things easier to animate later. Okay? So as we're building these things, and as we're texturing these things, the great part about this is everything I do, I'm going to do to the low polygon object, even the UVs, even texture work. Then the last step is simply putting the node that I choose on this high polygon object, and that's what ends up getting rendered. Okay? So all of the light stuff, right, the easier modeling, the easier texturing, and in fact I can hide the high polygon object and I can animate it faster because it's less information that we have to deal with. Then all we do, turn it on, turn the other one off, and the computer renders this pretty version for us. Okay? Now, there's something we have to notice. If I have both of them turned on and I try to render it, notice that we have two distinct versions of the object. The proxy method means that you're not losing one object. You're actually keeping both, which is a good thing. Now, let's take a look just by going into another one of our objects. And let's go with a cube, just because it's easy and it's simple to understand. Okay, here's my cube. When I use proxy, create subdiv, I'll go into my option box, and I'm going to choose the options. I'm going to go to Edit, Reset Settings. Now it's all the way that it should have been, just the way that you should see it now. Some of your options may be a little different. That's no problem. The divisions level currently is set to 1. That's no problem because we can always change it higher later. Smoothing UVs, that's perfectly fine. All this stuff here, this is all great. Mirror behavior, none. We don't want our duplicate object or our proxy object to be something other than what we have. Now, down here is what's important. The subdivisional proxy shader. Okay, this means I'm going to make a shader just for that transparent object. Or I can do this. I can opt to keep the shader that's on there right now, or I can remove it entirely and this object won't have a shader. We keep it transparent because we would prefer to be able to see the object and continue working on it while we see the smooth object inside. Now it says the subdivisional proxy is renderable. Of course, that's what we want. We also want to make sure that the subdivisional proxy is in a layer and that the smooth mesh is also in a layer. So if I turn this on and turn the other one on, the smooth version says, oh, do you want the smooth version to be in a layer that is also referenced so you don't accidentally select it? And that's what we want. So if I hit smooth, notice what we have is a box that is controlling sort of a circle. And when I say sort of a circle, you can see that it's not a very high polygon circle, but it certainly is becoming a circle. If I go into the history, I can choose the exponential level and increase it. Now at 2, it really starts to look more like a sphere. Okay? Now understand that although we could go higher to make it look like an even more complicated circle, as we're building detail into this object, it's going to be unnecessary to go this far. In fact, most of the time, I don't need to go any higher than 2. Sometimes when it's something that's really important and has to be really super smooth, I will bump it to 3, but that's not necessary. Okay? You may have also noticed that I have these settings floating up here. If you don't have these, that's simply underneath your display, your heads up display, and that's on poly count, meaning that whatever I have selected is going to tell me how many faces, how many edges I have. Okay? It's also going to tell me, if I pull back, how many faces is in the entire view that I'm looking at. And currently I have 4,041 faces, and that's all these different objects. Now, the best part about this is that while we begin working on our object, let's say we're going to extrude, we can see it all happen right in front of our eyes. And all I'm doing is extruding and hitting G to do it again. Okay. Notice that when we have polygons that are very close together, say this edge loop, right, and this edge loop, we start to get a tighter shape. Now, if I wanted to, I could double click on this and really push that tight to actually make almost a sharp edge. Now, we don't want to go too close to it because that will simply give us errors. See how it's starting to flip? We don't want flipping polygons. If I needed this to be even tighter, though, what I would want to do is I would want to instead choose my Insert Edge Loop tool and click inside here. Now we have tight edges here and tight edges here. Okay? Now, notice that because this one and this one are so far away from each other, we're getting a very round shape. Okay? Same thing here. If I grab hold of this set of vertices and pull it inward, what we start to get is a tighter shape. However, because these and these are so much further away, this is still a very smooth shape. So it's all about fine-tuning. It's all about increasing the topology and knowing where to put it in order to get what you want. Okay? So let's say, for example, if we were going to plan for this to be an animated object, we wanted it to be able to bend up this way. Notice that if we start flipping, we start cutting shapes into our object. We just have to know what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. Okay? Now, there is one kind of downside to using this method, and it may have been fixed in versions after 2010, but notice that every time I make a new proxy object, I get a whole new series of layers. Each one of these proxy objects is inside of its own layer, and each one of the low poly objects is inside of its own layer. Now, there are ways to get around this. Okay, you could, if you know what's going on, you could go back to that proxy option, and rather than letting it put everything into groups, you can do it manually. And this is something that I sometimes will do simply because it's much easier for me, and I'll simply right-click on the layer, hit delete, right-click on the layer, delete, right-click on the layer, delete, and continue until all of these layers are gone. Okay, then I'll make a new layer, and I will call this bike high poly. Now, I have my own color scheme, so I like to choose a dark red for the high poly object. Then this color pops up and I know what I'm looking at. Then I make another layer, and I'll call this bike low poly, and I'll choose a light blue. That way I see instantly that the bike and the bike low poly, high poly. And I'll take all the low poly objects, we don't need that one. I'll take all the low poly objects, and I will right click and assign the selected into the low poly. That way they can come and go. I'll then take the high poly objects, go into high poly, and assign add them. Now, because this layer I can reference it, I can't accidentally select it. So while I begin building my different objects, and we'll go edit, delete history, and I'm just going to save for good measure. I'll select this object, go to proxy, and this time, whoops, wait a minute, sorry. I showed you how to turn them off, I just didn't tell them to. So we'll turn off those layers, and I'll hit smooth. Now we don't have additional layers, so I can take the low poly object, assign it to that, select the high poly object, and assign it to that. Okay. Now the best part is this. Once we have all of these different objects inside of one layer, I can select objects, and I get all of them. And I can come over to my settings, and if I'm lucky, all of these will be set to the right level of continuity. Oops, wait, not continuity, exponential level. So let's see if we choose exponential level of 1, they all go to 1, exponential level 2, they all go to 2. So with all of them selected, I can simply come over here and change this control to make them all more or less smooth, which is very, very helpful. So I'm making another object, low poly goes to that, high poly goes to that, set it to a reference layer, and then set that, well, I can set that to any time I need to, but we'll go select objects, there's all of them, go to my poly smooth, exponential level can be 2, and this one updates to meet up with the other ones. Now, there's something you have to understand about this. If we were to delete history now, we no longer have that option, and this object no longer controls that object. So just be very, very careful once we start doing this. Remember, I've been saying deleting history is really important, deleting history is really important, but not when we need it. Okay? This is what's known as construction history. When we select these low polygon objects, we want these to turn purple, because if we don't turn purple, we know that we can't control them with the low polygon objects. All right. Now, that doesn't mean, however, that you can't continue working on this object. I'll just add in a couple more insets just so you can see. This has a bunch of history now. Well, if I go Edit, Delete History, on the low polygon object, that's not taking away from the history of the high polygon object. Okay, so that means that this low polygon object, you don't ever really have to do anything to until the very end when you're ready to render. Okay, now we'll talk more about that later, but I want to let you guys just go ahead and start working on your objects. Just bear in mind that it's very, very important to maintain good organization. Right now, I would have to take some time and grab these top groups, all this stuff up here, and group it so that now it is one master object. What I would also do is, this is the easiest way to do it. If you right click and select all of your high polygon objects and group that, so just hit Control G. So if we open up our hypergraph, hit F, there it is at the bottom. We'll call this the high poly group. We'll select the low poly and we'll Control G to create a low poly group. Then I'll take both of these and group them and call this geo. That means geometry. So that once we start in and we say, okay, well, this is a piece of geometry. Currently, all of this is geometry. But eventually, what's going to start happening is we want it to look like this. So here's my one layer, and I'll call this the funny bike. If I double click on this and shrink it down, when we have a lot of different objects in our scene, like an environment and different characters, each one of them will have its own master group. If we open it up, we'll have geometry, and we'll also have something like how it's rigged, how it's ready for animation, and that will be separate from the geometry. And then we might have things like well, we're not going to get into it, so I'm not going to talk about it, but there are so many different things that we can add to this right now. But I want the geometry to be all by itself. And sometimes, if there's going to be a piece of information, like currently the little nuts and bolts and things like that, these are things that don't have to be turned into a smooth object, right? These are things that look just fine the way they are. So those are pieces that don't necessarily have to end up in your high poly, low poly type groups, all right? But when we start building and organizing our bits and pieces, it might simply be easier to have the entire wheel as a single group, okay? But what you would do is the low poly would stay in the group and the high poly would go to the high poly objects. See, they can be separate. Even though they get grouped in the very beginning, they don't necessarily have to be. As long as you don't delete the history, you're going to be okay. Because what you're going to do is you're going to end up moving all of the groups, or excuse me, all of the groups being the low polygon objects, and everything will work okay. Notice right now it's not working, but don't worry, we'll get into how that all works, okay? But for now, remember, we're not talking about animating it, we're not talking about rigging it, we're just talking about modeling it, and this is what we want to do so far, okay? So have fun, enjoy, and I look forward to seeing what you make.